From the WJXT studios, This Week in Jacksonville starts right now.
Good morning. I'm Rick Mullaney, Executive Director of the Public Policy Institute at Jacksonville University, and welcome to This Week in Jacksonville. Kent Justice returns next week. Last week, Democrats nominated Kamala Harris and Tim Walz in Chicago, with a cast of speakers including 2 former presidents and 2 former First Ladies. Vice President Harris gave her acceptance speech on Thursday night. In part, she spoke of looking forward.
Our nation with this election has a precious, fleeting opportunity to move past the bitterness, cynicism, and divisive battles of the past, a chance to chart a new way forward. Not as members of any one party or faction, but as Americans. The future is always worth fighting for. And that's the fight we are in right now, a fight for America's future.
Both the Republican and Democratic conventions are now behind us. And here to discuss the path ahead for this November and much more on our monthly Hand on Government segment is Chris Hahn, a lawyer, former Chief of Staff to Mayor Alvin Brown, aide to the late Senator Bob Graham, and author of a book with the late Senator, America, the Owner's Manual, You Can Fight City Hall and Win. Chris, that was long, but welcome to the program.
Rick, good to see you as always.
Chris, the conventions, Republican and Democrat, are now behind us, 72 days to the election. I'm now putting you in charge of the Kamala Harris campaign. What does Kamala Harris have to do? What does the Harris campaign have to do to be successful come November 5th?
Well, Rick, they say about politics that it's a marathon, not a sprint. Well, it's now officially a sprint with those 72 days left until the election. And I think we've seen, Rick, over the course of not only the last month of her candidacy, but particularly the week of the Democratic National Convention, what the Harris campaign plans to do, and it's several-fold. One, clearly define the choice with Donald Trump. They recognize that every election is a choice. Voters have a finite number of options, and you need to very clearly define what that choice is. Also, she needs to define herself, introduce her to the public. She's now the presidential nominee as opposed to being the vice presidential nominee. That's a different level of visibility, and so they're trying to make sure Americans know her story and get to know her moving forward. But I think also, and you saw some of this in the vice president's acceptance speech, understanding that now that she has an energized and united Democratic Party, which wasn't the case after that June 27th debate, that the election comes down to undecided voters. People who are in PA, no party affiliation, or independent voters, even some disaffected Republicans who might be interested in voting Democratic, Democrats who might not be sure where they're going at this point, and particularly those undecided voters in the key swing states. So I think you'll see the Harris campaign focus a lot, not only on defining that choice, but a lot of outreach to middle-of-the-road independent voters to try and make sure they are in the Harris column come November.
So, Chris, on strategy, let me ask you, she certainly has enjoyed a honeymoon period, a grace period, and during this grace period, one of the criticisms you've heard from the Republican side is that she hasn't done any interviews, hasn't answered questions, hasn't been provided specifics on public policy. Do you believe that catches up with her, or is that actually the strategy for the next 72 days to avoid interviews and to avoid policy specifics?
Well, I don't think it's a strategy for the next 72 days. It might have been the strategy for the first month of the campaign. Remember, she didn't get in this race until just about a month ago. So, under a normal presidential campaign, no candidate would be doing lots of interviews during that initial month. I think you will see that change now that we're past the convention. They've had a month to sort of coalesce the Democratic Party, put a message forward at the convention. So I think you'll see more interviews, more interaction with the press, probably some press conference. She's done some of that in an informal way, but now that she's begun to sort of lay down kind of the keys of policy, she did a big economic speech in North Carolina a week before the convention, began to lay out some themes of her policy and messaging at the convention itself. Now that we're going into the fall campaign, as we get into the Labor Day weekend and then past it, I anticipate you'll see more interaction in that regard, and I know we'll talk more about this, but of course, the ultimate place to ask questions is going to be the September 10th debate she has with Donald Trump.
I do want to talk about that shortly, but now I want you to be the chief strategist for the Trump campaign. Over the next 72 days, what do you think the Trump campaign needs to do to be successful come November 5th?
Focus, in a word, focus. And I'm not suggesting the campaign isn't focused, but I think there's been some warranted concern that maybe the candidate himself is not focused. Look, for all of the exuberation over the Democratic ticket over the last month, this is still a very close election. When you look at national polls and swing state polls, the candidates are neck and neck. And former President Trump enjoys a polling advantage on some key issues, whether that's inflation, immigration, the economy. If he would talk about those in a consistent, focused way, drive that message home day after day, that would probably put him in the best position to win a second term. So far in this general election campaign, we have not seen that level of focus. It's made it hard for him to unite the party. It's given an opening to the Democratic ticket. I think the best advice for the Trump campaign is focus on where you're strong, be consistent in that messaging.
And what would that be, Chris?
The messaging to be focused on, like I said, around the issues of immigration, inflation, the economy, really focusing in on where they seem to have an advantage with voters right now. Every day, there's an old saying that every day you're not practicing, somebody else is, and when you face them, they will win. I think that's the dynamic that's happening right now. Every day the Democratic ticket is showing message discipline and the Republican ticket is not. The Democratic ticket has an advantage. That discipline on issues where they're strong, I think, is probably key to the Trump campaign getting back into its previous position.
So, Chris, we're short on time, but I do want to talk. There's a looming September 10th debate.
Right.
Kamala Harris has turned down a debate on September 4th. She's indicated pretty much this may be the only debate she's in. Given that, which is just over 2 weeks from now, this debate looms large. How significant is this debate, and do you believe it can be a game changer?
Well, it can, and just to be clear, this September 10th debate was previously set. Then the former president, I think, decided maybe I don't want to do that and suggested the September 4th one. Now they're back on September 10th. There will also be a vice presidential debate on October the 1st. But it's huge. It's going to be the first, maybe the only opportunity for the American people to see these two candidates side by side. We said earlier, every election's a choice. We're going to have a very stark sense on September the 10th what each of these candidates will do as president while they're standing there side by side.
So what do you think Kamala Harris needs to accomplish in this debate, and what about Donald Trump? For Kamala Harris, I'd suggest maybe a little bit of a mixed record in debating. If you look back to 2019 and 20, she certainly could deliver a punch, as she did with Joe Biden, but she also saw that on her feet, maybe it's a little harder for her to take a punch from a debater, as she did with Ms. Gabbard in that debate. And what does Trump need to do? What does Kamala Harris need to do?
I think they have sort of separate goals. For Vice President Harris, remember, there's already one former president on the debate stage. So somewhat like with her acceptance speech, there will be a question, does she come across as presidential in that debate? She started to answer that, of course, at the Democratic National Convention, but that'll be, I think, one issue people will be looking for. Also, does she effectively define that choice in the election? Does she lay out, very clearly what she stands for versus what former President Trump? And does she give as good as she gets? Look, this is a former prosecutor, as you are. This is when you're in the courtroom and you're on the political debate stage, involve a lot of very similar skills. So I think she's comfortable in that format. We know former President Trump is comfortable on the debate stage. He enjoys that dynamic. Again, I think the key for him is the same as the strategy for the campaign. Focus. Stay focused on your key issues. If you're out there talking about a bunch of, of kind of externalities and extraneous topics, you're not focused and you're not winning.
Chris, of course, we'll be here on September 10th. Glad you're going to stay with us, of course. Chris, we're going to have to take a short break. And when we return, what this means for the presidential race in Florida. And there are big amendments on the ballot in Florida this fall. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville.
Welcome back. Chris Hand is still with us for our Hand on Government segments. In past presidential elections, Florida has been one of the few battleground states in which the election results turned. But many prognosticators have suggested that Florida is no longer in that category. Chris, the conventions are now behind us. As we talked about in the first segment, we're looking 72 days from now. What about Florida? Is Florida's status as a swing state intact? What about Florida in this election?
Well, I think this election is going to be a pretty good barometer, Rick, as to where Florida stands as a battleground state. There'd been a lot of talk kind of early this year, particularly based on the 2022 results here in Florida, that the state was off that list. It was solidly in the Republican camp. Interestingly, in the month since Kamala Harris entered the race as the Democratic nominee, there have been a series of polls that show her anywhere between 2 to 5 points down in Florida, which would make it a close race. And there are some other factors, like some of the amendments we'll talk about later, which could influence the race. So I think where we're at right now is it may be, and I think we have to see how the campaign develops. If there are particularly national trends that provide momentum to the Democratic ticket, that may help to make Florida more of a swing state. Now, there are some other factors that really weigh in favor of the Republican ticket. They've got a very strong infrastructure here. They've got a significant voter registration advantage, somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million votes, depending on how you calculate that. Lots of money in the state as well. So I think Republicans have an infrastructure advantage, but sometimes national trends and momentum, just the overall tightness of the race can sort of kind of overcome some of those advantages. We're going to have to watch carefully and see how Florida develops.
You know, Chris, that top of the ticket matters an awful lot, especially for those down ballot races. Let's talk about one of those in Florida, the U.S. Senate race with Senator Rick Scott and Debbie Marshall Powell. What about that race? How competitive is it, and what factors are you looking to that could affect that race?
Well, number one, it may be in the Florida Constitution that Rick Scott has to run very close races. The last 3 statewide elections, he won by 1%, 1%, and 10,000 votes, less than 0.25%. So I think it's probably going to be a close race. The polling right now suggests anywhere from a 4 to 10 point lead for Senator Scott right now. As you say, that'll be very influenced by what happens in the presidential race, but it could be influenced by another factor too. The control of the United States Senate is in line. It's a map that favors the Republicans nationally. This is one of the few potential pickup opportunities for the Democrats. So if the race gets close and it looks like there's a chance to win, look for some potential national Democratic help for the Democratic candidate, Debbie Marshall-Powell. But there's no question that Senator Scott starts the general election as a favorite, has a few point lead. He certainly has ample resources, as he's shown in previous campaigns. I think a lot of that's going to depend on the national picture and how tight Florida is, generally speaking.
Well, Chris, let's talk about something that could affect both the presidential race and the U.S. Senate race, and that is big amendments on the ballot in Florida. Particularly, let's talk about Amendment 4 on abortion. How about explaining that amendment and maybe its impact on these two races?
Well, as we know, in the last couple of years after the Supreme Court overturned the Roe v. Wade decision, Florida, like some other states, passed a restrictive 6-week ban on abortions that has proven not to be very popular in the state. A variety of folks, kind of coalition, worked together, put this reproductive choice amendment on the ballot, which would essentially overturn that 6-week ban, put Florida more or less in the place it was when Roe v. Wade was previously the law of the land. That amendment, Amendment 4, approved by the Supreme Court, will be on the ballot. That is going to be a pitched battle here in the state. In many ways, maybe the highest visibility contest of any of them on the ballot. As we know, here in Florida, it takes 60% of the vote plus 1 to pass constitutional amendments. The early polling suggests that Amendment 4 does have that support. But again, 72 days left to go. There's a lot can happen, but there'll be a lot of national attention on Florida in terms of Amendment 4, the possibility of restoring reproductive rights.
Chris, let me ask you about Amendment 4. The Republicans had passed a statute a couple years ago, 15 weeks, with really a 15-week ban with some exceptions. And then the legislature came back from 15 weeks, which was the same standard as Mississippi that went to Dobbs in the U.S. Supreme Court, but they came back and reduced it to 6 weeks. Do you think the Republican legislature, from a political standpoint, overplayed their hand?
Well, I don't think there's any question that obviously 6 weeks, much more restrictive than 15 weeks. I think a 15-week ban might have been harder to overcome with an amendment. But look, I mean, there are a series of states in the country that have passed 6 weeks bans. And we have seen, by the way, in some of those states, states like Ohio, where voters have overturned that ban as too restrictive. Neither of us are women who have been pregnant, but when I've talked to some who have, they've said, look, in many cases, you don't even know that you're pregnant after 6 weeks. So I think there's a general perception that that's too restrictive, and I think has given some momentum to Amendment 4.
Let's talk about another amendment, very high profile in Florida, Amendment 3 on potentially legalizing recreational marijuana. In that race, what about the polling? Do you think it passes? And what about its potential impact on turnout? And who does it help and who does it hurt?
Well, I think whereas kind of Amendment 4 is probably a little more clear on who it might help and hurt, Amendment 3, which would legalize small amounts of recreational marijuana, seemed to have actually attracted a little more of a bipartisan coalition. There are both Democrats and Republicans who are in support of this. This is something to be that has huge economic potential for the state as well, so it hasn't been quite as clear a difference in that. There's some perception that Amendment 3 might help Democrats a little bit more, and like Amendment 4, it is enjoying kind of high results in polling. As we know, several states around the country have passed similar measures in recent years. Interestingly, with both Amendment 4 and Amendment 3, Governor DeSantis has come out pretty strongly in opposition to both of those. So it'll be interesting to see over the course of the next 72 days how active are those campaigns to oppose both Amendment 4 and Amendment 3.
Chris, we're going to stick on this topic of Florida and impact in Florida, but we're going to take a brief break. Sure. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to ask a very basic question. Is a red wave in Florida coming in 2024? That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
Welcome back. Chris Hand is with us for our Hand on Government segment. In 2022, Florida, led by Governor Ron DeSantis, had a remarkable red wave that included local, statewide, and national offices. The governor actively endorsed candidates, including endorsements in local school board races. Chris, it was remarkable. Everything from the Florida legislature in a supermajority, to the cabinet that went red, to the House of Representatives that went 20-8 in favor of the Republican side. 2022 was a red wave, unlike the rest of the country. But that's in the past, and here's a question for the present and the future. What does 2024 look like in Florida? Will there be a red wave? And how important are those DeSantis endorsements this year?
Well, I think we've already seen what a difference 2 years make. You're absolutely right. In 2022, Ron DeSantis was reelected with 60% of the vote. His candidates generally won. For example, in the school board races in 2022, he endorsed 34 candidates. 29 of them won, but it's been a very different 2024. He ran unsuccessfully for president. We're beginning to see pushback from the legislature on a variety of his initiatives. He wasn't selected for the Republican ticket, and he's suffering from what many second-term governors suffer from, which is a little bit of a letdown in his political standing. So that's manifesting itself in the ballot results. This year, in 2024, Governor DeSantis endorsed 23 candidates for Florida school board districts. 6 of them won, 11 lost. 6 more are headed to runoffs, and we'll have to see what happens in November. So it's a very different record here in 2024 than it was in 2022. Again, proving that 2 years is a long time in politics.
Well, let's take a look at the DeSantis endorsements here locally, for example. In the school board races this past Tuesday, we had 4 races for the school board, 3 of those in which Governor DeSantis endorsed a candidate. How about talking about those 3 races in particular and DeSantis' endorsement and how that played out?
Sure. Well, there were, like you said, there were 3 races where he endorsed. One was School Board District 1, where Tony Ricardo, who was a DeSantis-endorsed candidate, won by about 7% of the race. Also, District 7, Melody Baldock won. She'd previously been a candidate for the school board, well known in the district, so it's really not entirely clear how much the endorsement played there. But probably the most high-profile race was the race in District 3. Incumbent Cindy Pearson running for re-election against Rebecca Nathanson. That was one where tons of money came in to try and defeat Cindy Pearson. At the end of the day, she was re-elected by about 500 votes. So again, it's very much that mixed record. A couple of his endorsed candidates won, but probably the most high-profile one, the one where there was the most attention, his candidate did not win.
You know, Chris, one of the things the endorsement reflects is that they've become more partisan.
Sure.
And that leads to a topic of another amendment on the ballot for Floridians this fall, which is Amendment 1, and whether or not to have the school board races be partisan prospectively. How about describing a little bit of that history and what's on the ballot this fall for Florida voters when it comes to Amendment 1?
Well, in the past, Rick, Florida voters have been very clear on this issue. In 1998, they passed an amendment to the Florida Constitution that made Florida school board races nonpartisan. Here we are now, again, 26 years later, and they're being presented with the proposition to have those races become partisan again in the state. As we talked about earlier, it's a very high bar, 60% plus 1, to pass an amendment to the Florida Constitution. So I think Amendment 1 has uncertain prospects, and I think one of the ways we know that is the results of these school board races in the August primary. Again, there seemed to be some backlash, some pushback to the idea of making school boards more political. That probably does not bode well for Amendment 1, getting that high bar of 60% plus 1 in November.
Chris, certainly a topic you've discussed a lot is the significance of these school board races that we saw last week. How about just touching on that briefly and why these races are so important and what the district is facing?
Well, they're important generally because school board is, such a crucial part of local government that impacts so many different types of people: students, teachers, families, taxpayers, in terms of the way schools are financed. Particularly impactful right here in Duval County right now because the school district is really at a pivot point in many ways. It has a new superintendent, Dr. Christopher Bernier, who started on July the 1st. It's dealing with a funding crisis because of lowered involvement, some changes in state law, inflation. As we know, there's a big community debate right now about their school facilities plan and whether schools might have to be closed here in Duval County. And that's on top of the continuing questions that any school district faces about student achievement and student attendance and those kinds of issues. So really it's sort of a turning point, a pivot point for the Duval County Public Schools. That's why these school board elections are always very important.
Chris, we have 1 minute left, and one race regionally that drew a lot of attention statewide, which was the Senate District 7 race. This is one in which Governor DeSantis did get involved, and what he did was he endorsed Tom Leak. And some have considered, and that Donald Trump was supporting Sheriff Shore. Some have characterized this as DeSantis versus Trump. Do you agree with that characterization, or was this really more about trial lawyers versus business lawyers? And you got about 30 seconds.
Rick, I think you said it perfectly in our Tuesday night coverage last week. This was a proxy battle, in one hand between the trial lawyers and the insurance industry, on the other hand between Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump. A lot of money spent. What wasn't talked about in that campaign were some of the big issues affecting fast-growing District 7, affordable housing, the economy, insurance, those types of issues. But Representative Leak wins, moves on to the general election.
Chris, that's the final word for today. Thank you so much, Chris, for being with us.
Thank you, Rick.
I want to thank all of you for joining us. This Week in Jacksonville airs each Sunday morning at this time. Kent Justice returns next week. I'm Rick Mullaney with the Public Policy Institute at Jacksonville University. Have a great day.
See why every day more people are choosing News 4 Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.